We begin with that breaking news, which is in France tonight, where we're hearing sickening revelations in a newly released report into sexual abuse in the Catholic Church. An inquiry finding as many as 330,000 child victims since the 1950s. Our Europe Bureau Chief Hugh Whitfeld's right across this story tonight as it breaks. Hugh, good evening to you from here. Damning to say the least. What else came out of this inquiry?
Well, Michael, the key thing about this inquiry is that it was set up by French bishops themselves, but it is similar to the Australian Royal Commission, although this only goes back, as you say, to the 1950s, so only covers the last 70 years. It's found a culture of systemic cover-up in the French Church. 330,000, mainly children, sexually abused by priests and lay preachers within the church. 80% of the victims were boys, 2/3 of them abused by an estimated 2,000 pedophile priests. As I say, the rest of the pedophiles identified were lay preachers involved in church communities across the country. The report found the church had shown, quote, a deep, total and even cruel indifference for years towards the victims, blaming the church's views on the sanctity of the priesthood and sexuality as well for the ongoing cover-up which stretched on for decades. Many of the cases are historical, but only a handful of these cases are now being prosecuted by the French state. So only a few of them will end up before the court.
The independent inquiry into child sexual abuse just published a damning report alleging that Cardinal Vincent Nichols, who is the leader of the Catholic Church in England and Wales, repeatedly prioritised the reputation of the Church over the welfare of child sex abuse victims. The 154-page report found that between 1970 and 2015, the Church received more than 3,000 complaints of child sexual abuse from over 1,750 victims and complainants, filed against more than 900 people connected to the church. The report also noted that sexual abuse was a continuing trend, not just a historical one, with more than 100 allegations of abuse being reported every year since 2016. In reference to historical accounts, the report uncovered the church's maneuvers to protect alleged perpetrators by shuffling them between different parishes while failing to support victims and survivors. It highlights the case of Father James Robinson, who was moved to another parish after complaints were made against him in the 1980s. After fleeing to the US, he was eventually extradited back to the UK and ultimately convicted in 2010 for 21 sexual offences against 4 boys and was sentenced to 21 years in prison. One survivor reported that between the ages of 11 and 15, they'd been abused hundreds of times by a priest, and after every instance, they were required to make confession. Another case was revealed of appalling sexual abuse inflicted upon pupils at Ampleforth College and its adjoining junior school in North Yorkshire. Furthermore, one particular survivor who provided evidence to the inquiry claimed that thousands of pounds had been spent by the Diocese of Westminster to employ lawyers to keep victims at an arm's length while they built their case. Lawyers representing the victims, as well as activist groups and support groups for survivors, have called for the immediate resignation of Cardinal Nichols.
An explosive grand jury report is out, revealing graphic details of the molestation of more than 1,000 children by hundreds of predatory priests in Pennsylvania.
Even more disturbing, the abuse was allegedly covered up by senior church officials for decades. The investigation uncovered more than 1,000 victims identified in the church's own records for alleged crimes, often described as inappropriate contact or boundary issues. But the report alleges much worse.
It was child sexual abuse, including rape, committed by grown men, priests, against children.
The report concludes the Catholic Church in Pennsylvania had a pattern among bishops and church leaders of not helping children, but avoiding scandal. It names more than 300 predatory priests in 6 dioceses. From one end of the state to the other, home to more than 1.7 million Catholics, and almost every instance of abuse is too old to be prosecuted.
There is an ugly
In 2018 alone, an avalanche of sexual abuse cases has rocked the Catholic Church in Chile, the United States, and now Germany. According to a report leaked by the German weekly Der Spiegel, around 1,670 clerics and priests in Germany sexually abused 3,677 minors, mostly males, between 1946 and 2014. More than half of the victims were aged 14 or younger.
It's scary. Above all, it's terrifying that it took us so long to finally be able to present some numbers.
The report also found that 1 in 6 cases involved rape, and 3/4 of the victims were abused in a church or through a pastoral relationship with the abuser. In a statement, Bishop of Trier, Stefan Ackermann, said he hoped the findings would help ensure wrongdoing would not be repeated, though he said he regretted the leak.
We now know the extent of the sexual abuse as demonstrated by the results of this study. It's depressing and shameful for us.
Now, 7% of priests in Australia's Catholic Church were accused of sexually abusing children between 1950 and 2010. Cardinal Pell has been accused of sexual offences for a second time, but has constantly denied the allegations. The abuse allegedly took place in more than 1,000 Catholic institutions. According to the report, nearly 4,500 people, mostly children, were abused between 1980 and 2015. Well, Karen Middleton joins us now from Canberra with more on this. Karen, there's a commission, it's been set up, it's been ongoing for several years. What are the latest details and why are they emerging now?
Well, that's right. It's been underway since 2013, in fact, and we are now in the final 3 weeks of hearings. The final public hearings begin tomorrow, Australian time. And what this is a comprehensive survey of the data received or gathered of abuse within the Catholic Church. Now, we've heard evidence many times from victims of abuse within the Catholic Church, but this time the Church itself has opened its books, and we understand it's the most comprehensive survey of its kind anywhere in the world, and the statistics are quite horrifying, as you mentioned. In fact, a senior office bearer in the Church who's been overseeing the Truth and Reconciliation, Truth and Healing Commission that the Church set up to deal with this, described it today as shocking, tragic and indefensible. These statistics, as you said, 4,500 different people, 7% of priests in one order, the St John of God order of priests. The allegation is that 40% of them were accused of abuse. So the country is really coming to terms with these statistics at the moment.
A commission by the government looked at the handling of complaints against dozens of priests in Dublin. It reveals that hundreds of crimes against children went unpunished as police treated the church with far too much deference. Mark Simpson reports now from Dublin.
It's being described in Ireland as the ultimate abuse of trust. Not only did dozens of Irish priests attack children in their parish, the Catholic Church covered it up. Today's report concludes that the reputation of the Church was put above the welfare of the children.
As Archbishop of Dublin and as Dermot Martin, a person, I offer to each and every survivor my apology, my sorrow and my shame for what happened.
The Commission criticised 4 archbishops: John Charles McQuaid, Dermot Ryan, Kevin McNamara and Cardinal Desmond Connell. It said they didn't report to police their knowledge of abuse throughout the 1960s, 1970s and the 1980s. The investigation found that at least 46 priests abused more than 300 children. The Commission spent 3 years poring over 60,000 previously secret Dublin Church files and found 5,500 files that retired Cardinal Desmond Connell had tried to keep locked in his private vault. In a statement tonight, the Cardinal apologised and asked for forgiveness. Today's report also criticised the police. Some officers were reluctant to take any action against the church. In one case, it took 20 years for a priest to be prosecuted.
As a parent, as somebody in this community, indeed as somebody who was brought up in the Catholic tradition, I was absolutely abhorred by what I read, and it is really an awful indictment of people in the church and people who allowed it in the church to happen. And it is from a different era in that there was deference by some state agencies, which I don't think will happen today.
In Portuguese churches, in schools, in priests' homes and in confessionals, for at least 70 years religious men were abusing their positions of trust to abuse the children in their care. The victims were mostly boys, usually between 10 and 14 years old, but the youngest was just 2. At a press conference on Monday, the commission investigating the crimes delivered the results of their year-long mission.
These testimonies, as we will explain ahead carefully, allow us to reach to a much more extensive victim network, calculated at a minimum number, absolute minimum of 4,815 victims.